All right, this is how we're going to have to do it today, my friends. Let's talk about Ulysses after that short delay. Today we embark on the second half of the course, not only in terms of having our last three writings, but we've also passed our midterm essay, our midterm exam, and now we are moving into the 20th century from the 17th, the 18th, the 18th, 19th, 19th, and now the 20th. And our final three books will be the most modern texts that we encounter in terms of being truly modernist. Why do I say that? All three of these texts, James Joyce's Ulysses, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, there's Zauberberg, and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, all were written in the 1920s. In fact, Mrs. Dalloway was written after reading Ulysses by Virginia too. This is the modernist period in its truest form. The other texts that we have read are modernist by argumentation. These texts are modernist by nature in that they were written in the 1920s. The 1920s in the United States as well as Western Europe, as well also Eastern Asia and Russia were very big times precisely because of the existence of one thing that was known at that time and one thing that would come to be known in the next 20 years. Those are the two great wars, World War I and World War II. And so also at this time, there's the coming of new sciences like psychology and behaviorism and Pavlov and the dogs and operant conditioning. On the other hand, there's also the coming of psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who we will mention here today. Also philosophical schools that start to become very powerful, existentialism with figures like Sartre, Heidegger, and Edmund Husserl coming to prominence. All of this goes to say is that this is a time of massive disorientation. After a war that occurred between world powers that were supposed to be so economically interconnected that there would be no war ever again between great powers, there was a massive war that had unprecedented levels of death and destruction, and involved the use for the first time of, I think, planes were used for the first time in World War I, as well as, of course, trench warfare, bombing, shelling, and with that came the terrible psychological condition described as shell shock, which is not a proto version, but a significant version of trauma and body trauma. And so these writers in the 1920s, of whom there were many famous ones, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Edward Pound, exist in a time, T.S. Eliot, exist in a time of fractionation, of disorientation, of falling of empires, the disappearance of emperors, the disappearance of actual empires. The British Empire after 1918 starts to fall and lose control over its holdings, which many people who work in the sort of fields that talk about colonialism say is a good thing. And yet, for those who were British and for those who knew such a world, it was a sign of collapse, of change, of drastic, perhaps catastrophic change. And so when these writers write, and when you read Ulysses and you see in it a fractionated consciousness tearing at itself, characters torn between their own Roman Catholicism and their atheism, torn between their own Judaism and their own sensual Protestantism, as it were, like Leopold Bloom, who is himself ethnically Jewish, and yet he never goes to synagogue, he eats pork, and is not a practicing Jewish individual. Also, his mother was not Jewish, but his father was. His father, Virag, who was a Hungarian Jew who converted to Protestantism so that he could marry Leopold Bloom's mother. And so part of why this text is such a monster and so difficult to get through is that James Joyce is trying to infuse into it the essence of a century that does not know itself for what it is. A century that experiences such massive transformation that it cannot look into the mirror and see itself at this point. And so these writers are struggling to represent what the world is, and yet they don't know what the world is because of how quickly it has changed. And that comes through in this text. In this text in particular, I would say Ulysses, James Joyce through Ulysses tries to infuse his text with that disorienting feeling. He tries to disorient us, makes us uncomfortable, makes us dislike him at first. I don't necessarily know whether I like the text yet. You might feel that way your entire life. especially if you only read it once, but I highly recommend that you read it multiple times. There's an alternate strategy that Comas takes. His strategy for his character is to drop out, sort of like the 60s, 70s ethos. What is it? Get high, drop out, whatever the three things that are said by the beat poets at that time. But his idea is that since it is unclear what values one should strive towards, perhaps one should strive to do nothing. And so in the Magic Mountain, you will see how a sense of disorientation, like being lost in the woods or in the snow, leads to one circling around a single area without getting anywhere. And that will be his own expression of disorientation. Then Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway will feature our final old protagonist. And I say old for protagonist, not to call her old. She will be 50. And she will herself be meeting a man that was once going to be her lover before he went off to India to make his fortune, which is itself very much a colonial imperial theme in early 20th century Britain, going off to India to make one's fortune, for example. And so that text, I think, will be a little bit different, but it will give us our sole feminine perspective in this course. And so will be very, very much, will have to serve as representation of a feminine perspective in the modernist era in the 1920s, and also happen to be influenced by James Joyce's Ulysses too. So kind of a double work of modernism. All right, let me say some things about James Joyce himself. The life and times of James Joyce. He was born February 2nd, 1882, had a remarkable education at a place called Clongowes Wood College. I apologize for the pronunciation of that. English pronunciations can be quite difficult at times, especially British English pronunciation, like the Thames River is not the Thames, or like this place that looks like it's Worcester is called Worcester, for example. Very difficult to say something. 1898, he enters University College Dublin, where he learns French, Italian, German, Latin. You'll see all of those languages included in this text, including a little bit of Greek, though he didn't know it. He graduated in 1902 and initially was going to pursue medicine. He goes off to France, but in 1903, his mom catches cancer, and he returns to see her before she dies. This is repeated in Stephen Daedalus's life in Ulysses. His mother, in the text of Ulysses, also caught cancer in 1903. After he finished his studies, he returns to see her. But the difference between Stephen Daedalus and James Joyce is that by the time James Joyce came to see his mother, she was in a coma. Then she died. Stephen Daedalus returns as the favorite child of, I think, 13 of his mother. And she asks him to pray by her side, and he refuses. He refuses. And this is something important that you should know about Stephen Daedalus. He is a person of tremendous character and integrity, but causes him tremendous pain and suffering. Because he wishes to, as is said in Portrait of the Artist as a young man, to construct the unconstructed consciousness of his race, of the Irish people. Remember, the Irish people are people who are subjected by the British at this time. And he also feels himself subjected by the Roman Catholic religion, whereas he is a philosopher and wishes, like a literary individual, like a Homer, like a Virgil, like a Goethe, like a Cervantes, to speak with the voice of his people, to be the voice of his people. And yet he speaks a language not even his own. English is the language of his conquerors. It's the language of our conquerors, too, by the way. It is not the native Irish language. And so you will notice that Buck Mulligan, his boisterous medical school roommate, who is in medical school, does not speak Irish. He does not speak Irish, but their interloping British friend, Haynes, who wants to collect Stephen's set of sayings in a sort of Orientalist way, because he's this Irish guy who says these clever Irish things and wants to put this in a book of Irish sayings so that English people can read it. He speaks Irish. And not even the milkmaid that brings them their milk for their tea. They drink tea. Speaks Irish. So, and that too, you might see as part of what modernism is: a loss of authenticity and an increase of intellectualism. It is the intellectuals who see cultures as things to be studied and to be absorbed rather than to be lived. that seem to have this native knowledge. It's not that Irish people that continue to exist who know Irish, but this English person who wants to understand the Irish, who understands Ireland. And myself as a scholar, it feels particularly indicting. Myself studying people traditionally considered not my own. A couple more important things about Ulysses, actually. Let me put this in this note so it's a little bit. All right. He begins, 1904, June 16 is called Bloomsday. And every day, every year, June 16 is celebrated as Bloomsday. So I highly recommend that you visit Dublin on that day, or that perhaps you do something that you think is traditionally Irish. I don't mean to be sort of orientalist about it, but maybe you have a drop of Irish whiskey or something like that. Or get together for a reading group on James Joyce. It's sort of a fun thing to do that literary people do. This was also the first day the day on which James Joyce had his first date with his girlfriend, who would become his wife, Nora Barnacle. Beautiful name, Née Barnacle, and she comes to be known as Nora Joyce. Takes his last name, and so one way you might consider this text is that it is a gift to his wife, though a very odd gift. I think you will notice when we talk a little bit more about its features. Dubliners, one of his great works of short stories, which has one of his most famous works called The Dead at the end, which is a Christmas story. Highly recommend that you read it. It was started in 1905, but wasn't finished until was not published until 9 years later in 1914. He starts on a Portrait of the Artist in 1916 and finishes it in 1917, or rather, excuse me, he publishes it first in America in 1916 and then in England in 1917. That features as protagonist Stephen Dedalus, who is also protagonist of the first 3 chapters of Ulysses here. And so this is a character that goes from one book to another in the same way the characters in Thomas Pynchon's Fee show up in Gravity's Rainbow. So yes, is there a text you could have read to prepare for this more, to have a little more context? Absolutely. And it is a portrait of the artist as a young man. It's about 200 pages. And the last chapter is about him in school, sort of where you are at your time. And he's talking to his friend, who's continually speaking to him annoyingly in Latin, and trying to put together what he's going to do with his life. Is he going to become a young Jesuit? Because of his intellectual acumen, his teachers, who are priests, want to pick him out and join him or have him join their order, and yet he has the literary spark. If he were to become a Jesuit, he would have to give up his ideals of being a unique writer of the spirit of Ireland. And so it seems as if at the end of A Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man, he's choosing willful exile. He's choosing to live alone, a life without institutional camaraderie, without faculty camaraderie or fellow priests. You'll notice that he became, in chapter 2 of Ulysses, he is a teacher, and yet Mr. Deasy, the headmaster, says, I don't think you're going to be a teacher for very long. The reason is that he is not called to be a teacher. He doesn't feel like he wants to teach. He wants to construct the voice of 20th century Ireland. He wants to create a piece of art that itself speaks with the soul of the people with whom he identifies with, which means that he has to be unique, which means he has to do something unique, which means he has to be alone. And I really want you to think about this. This Stephen Dedalus character, 21, 22 at this time, very similar age to you. Could you make such a decision at such an age? And consider wrestling. Perhaps you are wrestling with this decision now to go into a profession like being a writer, where you are alone. And still surrounded by young people who are like, you're kind of a downer. Buck Mulligan is a really boisterous, interesting guy, likes to get drunk. It's like, let's go out on Coronation Day. By the way, it's called Coronation Day because the picture of the king was on the money. And so you get the king, you get the king's head. Coronation is to crown, to put on the head. So Coronation Day is like slang for payday. You get the heads of the guy, and then you go out and have some heady beer. And they will party. But these are the temptations that Stephen Dedalus is facing. His own people try to draw him into community with them, and yet in order to represent them and to become what he wants to be for them, to be the artist that shows them for what they are, he has to stand apart. And he he is fighting this battle the entire day that we get to see him during Ulysses. And remember, this book is set all in the course of one single day, in one real place, too, opposite from Don Quixote, where it's like, is it La Mancha? I don't care to even remember. It was somewhere like La Mancha. This is explicitly Dublin, 1904, with some anachronistic details from 1912 and the years following. Remember, this is first published in 1922, but it's set in 1904, so there are details that trickle into the text anachronistically from time that comes after it, that the author knows, but none of the characters within the text itself could. Just a couple interesting things to say about this text is it experienced tremendous difficulty being published, Ulysses did, because of certain elements. I'm going to say them to you, and this is why this text is taught in college and not in high school. It was received as scandalous. Scandalous. Because it has sex in it. It features onanism, which is to be autoerotic. Auto means self. And this happens in it. It involves a moment of defecation. A character, Bloom, sits on the toilet and enjoys having his morning constitutional, as we euphemistically say, while reading the newspaper. There is an instance where he's in a Turkish bath, and he can see his own lower hair, the hair from the lower part of his body trickling up. It reminds him of a plant. Of sorts. There's infidelity. Not only is Leopold Bloom carrying on a correspondence with a woman, Martha Clifford, who can't even spell the word right, says world, and when she says she's losing her patience with him, unfortunately writes the plural patience rather than the noun patience. You see how that's the sort of error that this is the sort of error that diminishes one's trust in the intelligence of the writer, particularly if that's their job. If you say that you're losing your patience, which would mean something like you're a physician and the people under your care are dying, rather than your patience, meaning that your attitude is degenerated, well, that's a pretty unprofessional error to make. In any case, it is the case that Molly Bloom, the wife of our other protagonist, Leopold Bloom, is at 4 o'clock this afternoon, the day starts at 8, planning to see her manager, or rather her agent and promoter, Blazes Boylan. Got spiffy shoes on, his apparently very handsome cat. Just going to see him. And Leopold Bloom knows that they will consummate their relationship then. And in fact, in chapter 18, he will find evidence of it, physical evidence of it. Not only food that they ate in his bed, but also evidence of a male having been there and committed a sexual act. And these are things that are included in this text. And these are elements in this text that create the perception by those who are perhaps prudish, perhaps a little overly conservative, perhaps did not read the text, but know about these elements. And it creates a vision that this text, rather than being epic, transcendent fiction that edifies, is perhaps pornography that indulges only in the lower aspects of humans and has no edifying of that, just seeks to put that which is filthy in front of humans. And filthy, I think, in a moral sort of way, but also very much in a physical sort of way. By the end of it, after you've seen all of these moments of onanism and infidelity and defecation, I want you to share with me whether you think that this is a work of pornography, or whether you think that this text tries to do something beyond what epic texts do, whether it goes for something like a hyperrealism, whether it attempts to reveal to us not only the outer workings and inner workings of people, showing their imaginations, the stream of consciousness that they embody, but also the moments in their day that they don't talk about, that they don't think about. To defecate, gross as it is a very common thing to eat and to pursue food and to cook food. Very common. It's something that happens daily. So there's something that Joyce is trying to do where he connects the transcendent and the universal and the eternal to the daily, the humdrum and the common. It's almost like what many Americans think of as Buddhism, right? Where the Buddhist master, when you ask him a metaphysical question, he gives you a material answer. But when you ask him a material question, he gives you a metaphysical answer. The idea is something like when you're like, oh, this water is too cold, this water is too hot, and he said something like, and that's life, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, I was just like complaining about the water, and now I knew some universal truths from this brilliant say. And I encourage you to try and see this in the text. It will be very difficult your first time through. This is an impenetrable text. Many people consider it, and it is not even the hardest text that he wrote, though it is the hardest text with a semi-coherent narrative that he wrote. Finnegan's Wake itself striving for incoherency because, as I said earlier, prior to recording, it strives to share the logic of a dream. Think of your dreams. Do they make sense? More or less, sort of, depending, kind of, not really, right? All right. By age 50, Joyce joins the rank of British, and I say British, not English or Irish. British is the encapsulating way of saying all the countries under the flag of the Brits, Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, and the English. He joins the ranks of those who go blind. Milton himself, John Milton, went blind, thought it was from a piece of meat. Ebenezer Scrooge, he thinks that he sees a ghost. Jacob Marley, because of a piece of meat lodged in his stomach somewhere. James Joyce, by the time he's 50, loses 100% of his seeing in his left eye. This is a very famous image of him. And he only has 10% of his vision left in his right eye. My father is a musician. I used to ask him this question. Tell me if you've ever indulged in this thought experiment. Would you prefer to go blind or go deaf? And he's always like, well, I'd probably prefer to go deaf. And I was like, but you're a musician. Couldn't hear music ever again. And he's like, it'd be a tough choice, but it's tough to give up your eyes. This is a writer, even though he's a very musical writer and a poet, loves music and includes many songs, which I encourage you to sing and to say out loud so that you can hear what he hears. Most of what he did was read. Can you imagine going blind as somebody who reads? So very much, to me, it's very much like an ultimate tragedy. And he did become very depressed and was considered very much a figure of the sad, depressed, woebegone artist by the end of his life. And yeah, one of the great ones. 1933, there was a Supreme Court decision removing Ulysses from the banned books in the United States. The United States versus one book named Ulysses, lifts the ban on the work. In America, it was this decision came by way of Judge John Woolsey. 1938-39, Finnegan's Wake is completed and then published. And 1941, Joyce dies from complications of an operation on a duodenal ulcer in his stomach. I can only imagine how difficult that was. And how painful that was. Ulcers of the stomach are considered extremely painful. A couple things about the setting of Ulysses. I mentioned that it takes place in 1904. It takes place on June 16th, the same date on which James Joyce had his first date with Nora Barnacle. He is so detailed in his representation of Dublin that not only he, but also another famous Irish writer and poet, Seamus Heaney, makes the claim of him, or makes the claim of his text, that if Ireland's Dublin were to disappear, that a 1904 version of it could be reconstructed from scratch just using James Joyce's Ulysses. In fact, let's see, the anniversary of 16, when the story of Ulysses unfolds, period. Joyce remarked that if his, this is from the New York Times, if his Dublin were destroyed, it would be possible to recreate it from the details in his own novel. So this is a novel in which he will be traveling through streets, going to pubs, going into newspaper offices, traveling to schools, being in the Martello Tower. These are real places that you will get to as you traverse Dublin alongside Stephen and Leopold Bloom. We'll see Molly later, but she'll be in her bed, the first place that we actually meet her when Bloom is making breakfast for her in chapter 4. All right, here's some famous criticism of James Joyce and Ulysses that I thought I would include, because this is such a difficult thing that you should know that excellent readers throughout time have also had trouble with this text and have been very critical. And in fact, there are lists and lists of great writers and their criticisms of this. But this is a letter that Carl Jung, one of the great first psychoanalysts, analytical psychologists, sent to James Joyce. Dear sir, Ulysses has presented the world such an upsetting psychological problem. Repeatedly, I have been called in as a supposed authority on psychological matters. Ulysses proved to be an exceedingly hard nut, and it has forced my mind not only to most unusual efforts. This is somebody who studied medieval alchemy in Latin, by the way. So just for context, but also to rather extravagant peregrinations or journeys. The peregrine falcon travels the most of any falcon. Speaking from the standpoint of a scientist, your book as a whole has given me no end of trouble. I was brooding over it for about 3 years until I succeeded to put myself into it. You do not have that luxury. But I must tell you that I'm profoundly grateful to yourself as well as to your gigantic opus work, because I learned a great deal from it. I shall probably never be quite sure whether I did enjoy it, because it meant too much grinding of my nerves and of gray matter. Also don't know whether you will enjoy what I have written about Ulysses, because I couldn't help telling the world how much I was bored, how I grumbled, how I cursed, and how I admired. Imagine you all do all of those things except for the final act with me. The 40 pages of nonstop run at the end. It's a string of veritable psychological peaches. This one, Molly, the wife of Bloom, speaks an entire chapter in 2 sentences. There are only 2 periods, though truly there are 3, because she starts her menstrual period during her speech, which you will pick up on, but the language is written in such a way that it is not grotesquely envisioned, but it is something that starts to happen, and is again one of these physical, traditionally vulgar bodily acts that is included in this text, which tries to represent the world as it is. I suppose the devil's grandmother knows so much about the real psychology of a woman. I didn't. What's always interesting about this, that Nora Barnacle supposedly read this letter and said, "My Jim, he doesn't know anything about women." And just a very funny thing to say. Well, I just try to recommend my little essay to you as an amusing attempt of a perfect stranger that went astray in the labyrinth of Ulysses and happened to get out of it again by sheer good luck. At all events, you may gather from my article what Ulysses has done to a supposedly balanced psychologist. With the expression of my deepest appreciation, I remain, dear students. All right, I'm going to finish with just a couple more quotes before giving it over to our presentation today. Additional criticism. Colm Toyven. It takes time and commitment to read Ulysses, said Colm Toyven, the celebrated Irish author who organized a petition to preserve the house for the public, and it is very rewarding if you give it those. And it's very rewarding if you give it those, but the dead, anybody. So he's saying that if you don't like Ulysses, at least give James Joyce another shot and read his short stories. Fair enough. Nora Barnacle, his wife, says, "I guess the man's a genius, but what a dirty mind he has, hasn't he?" T.S. Eliot, he single-handedly killed the 19th century. Vladimir Nabokov, who was himself a literary critic as well as a writer, wrote about Lolita, often has a low opinion of many great authors, including Cervantes and Don Quixote, but also Ulysses. Ulysses, of course, is a divine work of art and will live on despite the academic non-entities, people like me, who turn it into a collection of symbols or Greek myths. I once gave a student C-, perhaps B+, just for applying to its chapters the titles borrowed from Homer, while not even noticing the comings and goings of the man in the brown matter. George Orwell, when he reads Ulysses and then come back to my own work, I feel like a eunuch. A castrated individual who has taken a course in voice production and can pass himself off fairly well as bass or baritone, but if you listen closely, you can hear the good old squeak just the same as ever. And so you, I think, have seen